Thank you for giving me the chance to present a general idea of what building from Marx is about. It is, of course, a difficult task because time is short, and I'll mainly deal with my own article and touch upon the other two as well, Franz Fanon and Selma James, in the ways in which they connect to mine, in illustrating and substantiating my argument. Those aspects that I don't touch upon may come up in our in 2005, 16 years ago. And I have not carefully reread it since then. The others are that you are reading are even older. So what could be gained by revisiting them now? How can they help to better grasp our present day dilemmas and predicaments? When I look back, I found that ideas of Fanon, James, and my own actually are still being developed because the reality, their social relations, cultures, and politics we spoke to keep on unrolling, tangling, and reversing all the way into our time. Speaking for myself, I was pleasantly surprised that the method of inquiry, the kind of knowledge I pursued then, connected to revolutionary social and self transformation, do still direct my search at the present period. If anything, my concerns have been both amplified and focused more on ways of doing communist politics. And I say communist because small and big C communism and Marxism have been in my life since my teenage. Understanding communism as both an intellectual and politically practical option, I'm facing a time when in India, communist parties are fast fading. But importantly, popular resistance has not ended. Though political parties of the left have declined, paradoxically, popular social movements have risen on general communist principles. How are we to relate to these social movements with projects of the left parties? In this regard, I think the US politics of the last some years have similar interesting features. There, the political structures are being pushed from below by relatively leaderless, passionate social movements. But as Gramsci would have said, people are holding the intelligentsia and political classes as hostages to their demands. Probably they are not as ready as people are. Building from Marx was written in an earlier stage of such thinking, and the essay on method in the essays on method in the ideological condition, for example, depicts such a development. Outside the collection, two new articles serve as companion pieces of this piece, which I have written relatively more soon, more closer to our time. One is available. It's called Towards a Communist Revolution, Gender and Class in Capital, Volume 1, in an edition by Marcello Musto called Marxist Capital Under 150 Years. The other, The Factory and the Family as Spaces of Capital, is also edited by him in Rethinking Alternatives with Marx. Now, it's interesting that one's interest only deepens and doesn't fade as time goes by, because time is always forcing us to look in new directions. But now, going back to building from Marx and roughly following the logic of essay with the above questions, we have to ask our own question now. How should we put together a method of social inquiry that can respond to the vital necessity of changing the world, the 1% and the 99% world in which we live? How connect larger political projects against neoliberal capitalism with ongoing social movements? After all, this world that we live in is not natural or a testament of human condition. It was socially made and must so be unmade, and tacitly, the majority of people in the world share this sentiment. The argument of the essay is articulated upon the premise of the social, not in a theoretical sense, but in an everyday sense, as we daily live without analyzing social relations, practices, and ideas at every step that we take. As Marx said, we begin from real people. The social we know how to negotiate, the social whose interactions teach us daily how we are treated by others and how to treat them with settled practices and intelligent or ignorant assumptions. As experiencing subjects, we feel the same active knowing aspects of society as power. This social, then, is a whole formation. Of course, it is true that the texture of this world is complicated. Events, practices, and experiences are far flung. Here is not there, but someone's there is someone else's here, and overall is connectivity. This social, then, is a concrete formation. Another term which is key to my text. What is concrete supposed to mean? Very briefly, even simplistically, the concrete is an expression for things or objects whose wholeness is made with multiple social relations, cultural, economic dimensions. It makes a formation what it is. It is the thisness of a perceivable object, though not always perceived by us in its multidimensionality or existence in relation to others. The word object here contains an unexpressed subjective drive as attributed to a social formation. As Marx says in Grundrisse, and I quote, the concrete is a convergence of many determinations of identifiable or unidentified forces and features. The two concepts, the social and the concrete, often serve as synonymous and indicate a relational, activated, and acted upon formation. An example of the concreteness of a social object is felt when the idea of a certain type of person presents itself to the onlooker's mind. When we appear to others, that example myself, an older woman of color, this is not just meaningless physical appearance. It evokes a social way of seeing in which I and my onlooker are immersed. It's not just a body, but a body understood, therefore, an appearance. The viewer and the viewed are here concrete formations, their divergent features congealing into a meaningful figure as a whole. These features or significations or determinations are produced and reproduced historically. People's perceptions or experiences are not in serial order or consecutively. Their actuality is immediate and concrete. Gender, race, and class are thus unconsciously or commonsensically integrated. Concreteness of our encounter involves a common communicative competence. Let us consider the murder of the South Asian Muslim family in London, Ontario. In this concrete sense of perception, in a race-saturated society, this white young man knew them, underline, even though he didn't know them personally. His social common sense perceived them as a signal of danger to his society, to white normativity. He did not invent this connotation, but at least 3 centuries of common sense of white supremacist, settler colonial, slave owning, racialized capitalist society went into the making of this common sense. His knowledge is thus historical and socio-political. It is civilizational. Altogether, he sees our social as concrete. Concreteness of the social is made with multiple determinants, I said. And these determinants enter into mediatory relations which constantly keep shifting the equilibrium for concreteness. But how is it that we do not see the social as an integrity of appearance and ontology? How can we ignore the role of time in their materialization as a morphing history? If we want to change society, we must treat society concretely. That is what needs to be changed and how that came about. We need to comprehend the mix of determinations that creates a specific mode of production for us, namely capitalism. Seen as an overall social formation, class in capitalism becomes a manifestation of a particular set of social relations and organization. As a concrete reality, class as we live it cannot be considered as self-constituting thing without historical cultural content. Thus, gender, race, and class cannot be considered non-constitutively. Class is more than an economic category, and capitalist production is conducted within a social mode, much of which does not directly emerge from the commodity form, from the production floor of a factory. Here we need to accept that class and capital are power relations, and they show power between the producer and the appropriator of surplus that pre-existed capitalism, as also did gender patriarchy. Race, also as an oppressive, dehumanizing difference, especially in labor, pre-existed and removed their moral valence as fully human. Class became a general social practice, wage labor, thanks to the combination of violent primitive accumulation and the pre-existing practices of slavery, bonded, indentured, or self-labor. The market too pre-existed with money, but in capitalism, they became the main doors for accession of all necessities of life. The issue of determinations implied in the formation of concreteness shifts to the question of difference. Though I'm talking about a constitutive space or relation, it is a question of difference that is most important for us. It can be argued, perhaps, that the idea of the concrete as a unity of multiple determinations, as these determinations in their mediations are rendered homogenized forces or sources, would not be the right assumption for us to have, as in fact the formative moment of the concrete could not be achieved if there were no difference, but all elements of the social relations were horizontal or of the same and similar nature. Of course, there are different kinds of differences. Ones which are mere diversity, a passive array of multiplicity, and those that are in a dynamic, active relation to each other. They feed into each other, these active, dynamic ones, and call for formative changes to texture the overall social fabric, where the threads run in opposite directions. It is such a problematic of mediation that Selma James and others, such as Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Silvia Federici and so on spoke about. In reading James's text, we see that she is revealing the actual formation of capital by showing its absolute dependence for social production on biological, physical, everyday, daily social reproduction. The family form undergirds that of the factories, and that difference itself is essential to the system as a whole, which appears to be value neutral contract on the surface. By establishing a difference between wage labor and housework, the capitalist mode of production runs smoothly and profitably. This is the issue which is now being inquired into and further developed in the social reproduction feminist theories. Differences, however, can form clusters. Like has an affinity with like. Differences that signify powerlessness and oppression and erasure of humanity coalesce against those signifying power. A most important power is the right of naming others, as God does his creatures in the Bible. This signifies an actual control of life processes, of many by a few. This is part of a total hegemonic process for the colonizer or the slave owner. In the essay Unveiling Algeria, Fanon speaks to this. Here, difference is weaponized to the ability of penetrating the core of the colonized society. Fanon allegorizes this through the act of unveiling. Whether veiling is a good or bad practice, whether Fanon himself had a paternalistic gaze towards Algerian women, is not relevant here. What is important for us is how this type of difference fuels the project for a subjugated cosmology regulating the social life of others. So we can understand that race is born of such a difference. It emerges in the process of ruling, oppressing, and exploiting. As such, race is in the eye of the beholder. It is not what people themselves initiate. Yet once put to work, this notion circulates in all aspects of life and society, and the inventors of race themselves at the same moment. Self-distinction of whiteness is the correlation of blackness. Race, therefore, consists of socio-economic, and cultural imperatives. It legitimates dehumanization of others. Here, of course, we must attend to the question of the body, gendered and raised, which is reproductively conjugated in all senses. This condition is shared by the mistress and the maid in race class appropriate ways. Gender and race are thus interpreted embodiments, providing social content to class to make it into a concrete reality. Where slavery is not direct, colonization with plantations, etc., interpret the colonized society in civilizational terms, sometimes, as Fanon shows, employing the sexist rescue myth to seek hegemonic control. The harem, as Malik Al-Bullah shows, is a site for projection of colonial masculine libido. In our own yard, the question of hijab, the core of Islamophobia, control of Afghan women's body, launched 1,000 warplanes on Afghanistan and social legislations on religious symbols in Quebec or attacks on mosques. The state and white civil society united in the same colonial control. They felt the fury of the French colon in being denied the right to break open a society's harem or inside at will. This concrete approach is a formational one, where the unity is a constellation of difference, not their suppression. The adjunctive meaning of these differences are socio-historical because many of them have pre-existed the rise of capitalism by millennia. They have continued and morphed as needed, and there is no historical amnesia that the world has suffered. Kings came and went, feudal lords morphed into capitalists, but the mode of production achieved its social form through them. Capitalism is no exception. The abstraction of the formula of capital, MCM prime, is just a recognition pattern in one dimension. Actualization of capital as an existing practice is always concrete and makes do with whatever it finds around. Let us now round up the story and go back to the initial problematic of the concrete character of the social, which is a convergence of many determinations resulting in expected and unexpected formations through their constant mediations. The idea of historical materialism implies this. As an aside, we need to distinguish between Hegel and Marx's philosophy of concrete. Namely, in Marx, history has a popular subjective agency, and instead of reflecting an idea as it does in Hegel. Yes, it is contingent, this history, because it is already there when we are born within a given society, not within a social vacuum. The world will continue even when we die. Thus, social history is internal to our productive and reproductive lives, our modes and means and ideas. Here, Marx's emphasis on determination comes in, that people do make history, but they do not just make it just as they please. They have to recognize where they live and how, and react to these determinations responsively. We have to recognize the internal shaping presence of history, which may be coded as gender, race, class, and other social relations. History and social forms are always there. It is in our ways of seeing and doing, even when we are not aware of that. Here we need to raise the question of class again, and why it is constantly associated with the idea of the economic. It is not that class is not economic. It captures the reproductive cycle of capital, but as a one issue category, as an economic singularity, it is not operational. It needs a social content in order to be realized. It is through different social processes, their impacts and experiences on and of people, their accompanying forms of consciousness, that workings of class become concrete. The economy happens within and as the social, implicating previous and current productive, consuming, and circulatory practices. Thus, why capital has to have a local, that is why capital has to have a local as well as an extra local character. While all forms of capitalism have specific historical, sociological character, the bare bones abstraction of their basic schema are the same, but equally capital has uneven and distinct characteristics because it is terrain dependent. Though an abstract organization at levels of exchange value and circulation, it needs still to articulate modes from current and previous ones. Patriarchy, slavery, bondage, and other non-monetized forms of labor can easily become the elementary supply chain of the commodity form. Now we need to turn to the question why the social doesn't appear to us as concrete, but as a diverse, segmented fragments. A very important reason lies in how we think about the world. The type of social knowledge we rely on, a version of social thinking that Marx called ideology. And here I have to repeat again that all ideas are not ideology, though ideology consists of ideas. Now, ideology is a binary form of thinking which separates consciousness from life. The economic can be termed as base, from culture, which can be termed as superstructure. Raymond Williams has an excellent discussion on this topic in Marxism and Literature. This disarticulation between base and superstructure is found in ideology's serialization of race, gender, and class as three strands that interweave. Now, for the purpose of theorization, we may use these terms as distinct categories and interweave them, but we must not forget that they are not self standing, and the social within which we live and we have to work with is multidimensional. This reading habit I will name as ideological or one sided one. For almost 2 centuries, we have read the social as a political economy. Marxists and anti Marxists both subscribe to an economistic and binary reading of existential and intellectual endeavors. The piece of Marx, written in 1859, the critique of political economy that is being included here in your syllabus, offers a scope for doing that. But it is only a very small part of Marx's opus and is followed by other things before and after. Their overall thrust of the overall thrust of Marx's opus is not thus. There is also an organizational aspect for the erasure of the concreteness of the social, because it ramifies through vast areas of space and lengths of time. Space here is not only a geographical matter, but one created by activities of capitalist expansion. Thus, homes and factories, the birth and journey of the commodity, changing forms and values of labor are all implicated in the formation. The lived time, that is, experienced time of commodity production, also needs to be taken into account. The more far-flung capital is, the more complex in its division of labor and mechanization, elaborating in political and social institutions, the more difficult it is to only rely on our individual faculty of perception to capture the social concreteness. Through its meshes of workings of difference, we cannot see the concrete whole just at a glance. This is where social mapping, intellectual work, analysis, and critique come to our aid. As we delve deeper, we see that this vast system is moored in the humble lives and daily labor performed by ordinary human beings, involving all their sensuous and practical capacities. Capital Volume 1 discusses this organizational aspect for creating visibility and invisibility and the consequent emergence and the effects of commodity fetishism. This fetishistic conception of the social creates a reificatory gaze, and that results in isolating complex social determination from its creative activities and ideas. Thus, the categories of race, gender, and class lose their constitutive character. This appearance of a self-sustaining and independent category would not endure, though, through a critical scrutiny. Further, and I think that is where I'm going to end now. And I think in the Q&A we can deal with some questions I have raised, but I have not answered. Thank you.